No constitution, only Sharia rule. Thursday, September 17, 2020. The talks were scheduled to take place in March. The agreement was between two great powers. One represented the gods of worldly equipment, technology, and economic superiority, and the other was the face of a few thousand courageous Taliban armies who relying solely on the one and only God alone for the past 19 years and were fighting to enforce his Sharia law. The Doha talks were about the future of this country of Afghanistan, whose government was recognized by the United Nations, all its subsidiaries in every country in the world as a legitimate government. But when the Taliban refused to accept Ashraf Ghani's externally influenced government as a legal and legitimate government, then no country in the world and no international body dared to bring this so-called government on par with the Taliban in peace talks. From Ashraf Ghani to Abdullah and his supporting country, everyone sat far away were watching the blessed spectators in amazement. At the beginning of the talks, roadmap was written on July 8, 2019, then the United States and the Taliban wrote at the beginning that both groups agreed to institutionalizing Islamic system for the implementation of the comprehensive peace. From this roadmap until the U.S.-Taliban agreement was reached on February 29, 2020, there were countless negotiations, but every group that considered itself the master of Afghanistan's destiny was kept away. There were two major decisions in this agreement. The first is that the Afghan government is not a legitimate government, but the Taliban will allow it to negotiate with them as a group like other Afghan groups. The second is that before the talks, U.S. forces will start to leave the land of Afghanistan and prisoners on both sides released. The Afghan government, which considered itself a recognized government of the member states of the international community, began trying to thwart the agreement at the behest of India and other sympathizers. The evacuation of U.S. troops had begun, but the exchange of prisoners was hampered. The war continued. The prisoners were released and finally the month of September 2020 came. The Afghan government now had only left with 6 key members of the Taliban, and Australia, France and even the U.S. Pentagon have been pushing not to release them. The two groups were present in Qatar for talks, but the talks could not begin. The Taliban demanded that we would not come to the negotiating table without the release of these 6 prisoners. After several days of negotiations, the world powers who were proud of the fact that we are very powerful, were stood silently and a small plane flew from Doha airport to bring the 6 Taliban. After being released from Bagram prison, the 6 Taliban were asked to change their outfits and embellish the new clothes we have brought, so that they can be presented to the world better so that people could not recognize the difficulties of the prison from their faces. The same number of journalists were seated on the plane as the number of Taliban so that they could immediately confirm their release and start negotiations. Here, the plane left Doha and the other side started negotiations. The 6 released Taliban leaders were isolated in a house in Qatar due to the coronavirus. The talks began with speeches by 15 world leaders. The first speech was delivered by the Foreign Minister of Qatar, Abdul Rahman Al Thani, who said, "The warring powers must make decisions according to the challenges of the modern age and find a solution that transcends all differences and has no conqueror or loser." U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, "You have the opportunity to resolve your differences. You are going to make decisions not only about the present generation but also about future generations." Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said, "Afghans should make their own decisions without any external pressure and they should be in control of their own destiny." In similar words, Indian Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar said, "Leadership, ownership and control of this peace process should be in the hands of Afghans alone." But Jaishankar's speech also included demands that the Afghan government later made to the Taliban. Jaishankar said the talks should focus on human rights, democracy, minorities, women and the underprivileged in Afghanistan and think over the extremism in Afghanistan. Here the Indian Foreign Minister lamented Indian investment, which had been lost. "There is no corner of Afghanistan where our 400 development projects have not been implemented," he said. All of these speeches were made via video conference due to the coronavirus. From the beginning of the negotiations, the state secretary kept instructing everyone to wear masks, but how fearless were those servants of God that they entered the hall without wearing masks or even not when sitting in the negotiations. Prior to the talks, India had taken a statement from Afghan Vice President Amrullah Saleh to spoil the talks, saying that the Afghan nation could never forget the Durand Line with Pakistan, because they knew that Peshawar was their capital. Responding to India's mischief, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Alice Wells directly tweeted, "All groups and politicians should know that the Durand Line is an internationally recognized border. They need to build a peaceful and economically prosperous relationships between Pakistan and Afghanistan, instead of making claims based on nationalism in the past." The response from the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State was a diplomatic response, but Amrullah Saleh's convoy was severely attacked on September 9, in which he narrowly escaped. India's sharp retreat, the helplessness of the U.S.-backed Afghan government and the U.S. government itself were to be seen when the Taliban presented the name of Maulana Abdul Hakim Haqqani as their team leader in the talks. Maulana Abdul Hakim is respected in the religious circles of both Afghanistan and Pakistan. He is also called Maulana Abdul Hakim Ishaq-Zai. He has been associated with teaching in a madrasa in Quetta for a long time and is very close to the Emir of the Islamic Emirate, Maulana Hibatullah Akhundzada. The miracle of Momin's intellect is that as long as the Taliban negotiated with the United States, Columbia University graduate Maulana Abbas Stainkzai was made head, but when it came to negotiating with the Afghans, a great scholar of Islamic Sharia is presented. During the talks, the Afghan government made the same demands that the Indian foreign minister had made in his speech, Constitution of Democracy and Women's Rights. The same slogans that influenced the secular liberal media. The Taliban, on the other hand, made only one demand: whatever happens will be under the rule and enforcement of Islamic Sharia, whether it is the rights of women or minorities or the method of power. He said, "We have not fought for 19 years for the conquest of the region or for national liberation. We have fought only for the implementation of God's law on the God's land. If that doesn't happen, it's time to dump this agreement and we move on to the war again."